Santos, our program coordinator. All donations are tax deductible. The link for donations will be in the chat, and also it's on our website. As Natasha mentioned, this event will be recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as on our public access TV program, War No More, which runs every second Tuesday of the month at 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. and Thursday of that same week, also 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. If you have any friends, especially senior citizens who aren't comfortable using Zoom or computers but have access to cable TV, please let them know that they can watch our programs there. As Natasha mentioned, the chat will be disabled except for questions directed to the host, but will be open at the end and will stay online for several minutes for those who want to chat with other attendees. We missed the chance to be with each other in person. I'd like to thank the many organizations who co-sponsored this event and helped us to get the word out. They are Brooklyn Bay Ridge Peace Action, Fort Greene Peace, Move the Money, New York City, the New York City War Resisters League, Peace Action, New York State, United University Professions, and Veterans for Peace. And I also want to thank the so-called essential workers who kept our city going over the past year and who have enabled us to be here together tonight. And finally, let me thank the members of the Peace and Economic Justice Committee, especially Matt Weinstein, who did the heavy lifting to make this program possible. I will now turn the program over to Bruce Altshuler, Brooklyn for Peace co-vice chair, who will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. And thanks again to everybody for showing up and being here tonight.
Hi, I'm Bruce Altshuler. Am I on here? As Charlotte said, I'm co-vice chair of Brooklyn for Peace. I'll explain the format and introduce our speakers in a couple of minutes. But first, I want to introduce Matthew Weinstein, who is going to say a few words. If he can unmute himself.
Don't address me in the third person. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I really am. I'm a long-time peace activist going back to the 60s. And when I moved to downtown Brooklyn, I joined Brooklyn for Peace, and I've been a member and an activist in that organization, proudly to say, ever since. Tonight, when we have these forums and we gather around us, you, our comrades and colleagues and fellow activists and fellow travelers and friends, we are not only an educational organization, we are very much an action organization also. We have a long and proud history of that. And so even though we have a pandemic and that has limited our ability to speak to people in the streets, we still ask our friends like you tonight to take part in some actions regarding the subject matter of tonight's forum. So let me just share my screen with you. This is the first ask, and get your pens out or type on your computers these few little links that I'm going to give you in this slideshow so that you can take action tomorrow and in the days that follow on these two basic questions. One is federal, which I'm going to talk about right now, and one is local. But they both have to do with peace and with labor, which are the subjects of, and social justice, which are the subjects of tonight's forum. So let me share this now, if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, hold on one second. Good. I'm going to share this. I did it, and I'm going to go full screen, right? Yes. Okay, so this first ask that we ask of you, our listeners tonight, our viewers, is to take action on a very important pending piece of legislation that is HR 842. You can see it on your screen. That's called the PRO Act. PRO stands for Protecting the Right to Organize. Now, looking back historically to the labor movement of the 30s, with the huge upsurge during the Depression and the organization of our industrial unions in this country, they worked with very hard to get organized, and they met with a lot of resistance and a lot of defeats. But finally, with the ascension of the FDR administration, government passed some very important pro-labor acts that allowed unions to make those breakthroughs and finally get organized in steel and in auto and in many other unions, coal, etc. Then we saw decades and decades of pushback from ruling circles in this country, particularly corporate and wealth, which saw how effective labor was in pushing progressive legislation and progressive bringing up the levels of working people and diminishing the power of corporate interests. And that has gone on for decades in this country. And the extent has been that that labor has seen a real diminution in their power over the years. From 79 to 2019, labor unions membership was cut in half. And if you follow the blue line on the graph, you'll see that the working class, what they refer to as the middle class, we can call it the working class, share of the aggregate income of the wealth of this country declined at the same rate that labor declined, that labor unions declined. In that period of time, 79 to 2019, average incomes for the bottom 90% of households increased just 1%, but the average incomes for the wealthiest 1% increased more than 184% to the levels of income inequality that we have today. And, we saw the Amazon election and we were all disappointed with it, but again, it had its precedent in earlier periods also where steel and auto tried to organize for decades and finally made that breakthrough. And we're seeing an upsurge in labor today, which we're going to hear about tonight. But this pending legislation, this PRO Act that we want you to write to your Congress representatives and senators, is a major step forward in reinvigorating labor's ability to organize, because it will put teeth back into enforcement that will hold corporations accountable when they violate workers' rights, and it will put labor on an even playing field, coming up against these huge powers like Amazon and other giant corporations. And let's remember also, folks, that we in the progressive movements for peace and for Black Lives Matter and social, racial, economic justice, we welcome labor's input and participation. But we have to, it's a two-way street, we have to give back as well, so that when we see something like the PRO Act, we have to extend ourselves and extend a helping hand to the unions and take an active stand in helping workers organize. So this is what we want you to do. Whoa, that's fancy. These are two bit.ly links that I'd love you to write down tonight. One is to find your House representative, in case you don't know who they are, and the other one is to find your senators, who I'm sure you all know. But when you go and click on those links, you will be taken to the House site and the Senate site, and there you have the contact information with the phone numbers, email contact, etc. And you just take the opportunity, take a few minutes during the next few days to tell these House reps and senators, even if they are already supporting it, to get that you are very, very urgently want them to get out and work for passage of the PRO Act, which will put unions on a level playing field with the corporate giants. So thank you very much for that, and give me the opportunity. And I'll see you later in the show with another ask.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. We're now, soon we'll introduce our speakers. The format of our forum tonight is we have three excellent speakers. We'll introduce each of them one at a time. And then when they're done, we'll take audience questions. So as you're listening, if questions occur to you, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll read as many as we can and put them to our speakers. Our first speaker is Michael Zweig, who's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where he was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Working Class Life. He led his union United University Professions into U.S. Labor Against the War as a founding affiliate in 2003, and served for many years as a national co-convener of U.S. Labor Against the War. Zweig is the author of many articles in professional and general interest journals, and the author of 5 books, including The Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret, and What's Class Got to Do with It? American Society in the 21st Century. So without further ado, I turn the mic over to Mike.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here with you, and very nice that my union, UUP, is a sponsor also of this event. I have the privilege and the task of talking today about labor's foreign policy. We have a labor movement in the United States, and the unions are very much concerned and directly involved with the terms and conditions of employment, wages, and grievance procedures and seniority procedures and all kinds of things that go on the shop floor or in the classroom. But we live in a world that is an integrated global capitalist system. And so our attempts to win victories or to secure union rights in any particular place in the US, any particular industry, and a particular union is inevitably linked up and merged in with what is going on all across the world. And the reason for that is because the capitalist system that we're part of is a global system. So that is the foundation, the real material foundation for labor international solidarity. And I think that when we talk about the labor movement and economic and social justice, one part of that agenda for the labor movement needs to be this question of international labor solidarity, not just in a tactical sense of, well, they have a strike going on in our industry, and so we should support them because then they'll support us, but because they are fighting with the same enemy and dealing with the same capitalist system as we are. And our work in U.S. Labor Against the War, particularly in opposition to the U.S. war and occupation in Iraq, is a very good example of that, and I would just want to talk about that. U.S. Labor Against the War got started in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003. And we were a bunch of activists and union organizers and union leaders around the country who thought that it was every bit of labor's obligation to participate in the growing peace movement that was coming and to bring labor into the peace movement and peace movement into the labor movement. And as part of that opposition to the war and occupation of Iraq, we decided to bring Iraqi labor leaders to the United States. And in 2005, we had a tour of 6 Iraqi labor leaders that came to the US, and we took them to 26 cities around the country. And what was so striking and what was so powerful about that trip was that workers and other people, students and community people all around the country got to hear directly from these Iraqi union leaders why it was that they were opposed to the war and occupation and what it meant for them to have that war go on in the midst of their trying to build a labor movement and worker rights in Iraq. And so concretely, they found with the US occupation that the American interest was to privatize the Iraqi oil fields, privatize the Iraqi economy, and they were opposed to that privatization. They wanted the right to organize public sector unions. There were no rights to public sector unions in Iraq. That was a very urgent question for them. They wanted to have union rights as part of building democracy and a democratic society in Iraq. And they thought that that was a very important part of what their agenda was, not just for their own industry, their own workforce, their own shop, but for the democratic basis of the entire society. And they opposed the war and American occupation, even though it had overthrown Saddam Hussein, who they were certainly no fan of Saddam Hussein. But their view was that getting rid of Saddam was their problem and their business and not the business of the American military and American corporations. So they thought that the war and the occupation was interfering with their ability to challenge privatization, was interfering with their ability to organize and organize in the public sector. It was interfering with their ability to build a democratic, secular, non-sectarian society. And so they opposed the war and the occupation. And we in the US, listening to that, could understand very well that we too were fighting against privatization of American industry, government services. We too were fighting for the right to organize. They didn't have it in Baghdad. We didn't have the right to organize public sector's workers in North Carolina either, or in Arkansas, or in Mississippi, or in Georgia. So these were all questions that were the same for the Iraqi workers as they were for the American workers. We too understood that our labor movement was part of building and defending democracy in our own country. And we certainly see that with what's going on with Trump. So those were grounds for our opposition to the war and occupation of Iraq. And it turned out that they were exactly the same as what the Iraqi workers were talking about. And that is the basis of international labor solidarity. We see it in Colombia, where the workers are trying to organize unions, and Coca-Cola organizes death squads to come in and shoot them. In the Philippines, Duarte is also undertaking vicious campaigns against labor. The CWA in the United States is trying to organize their call center workers and so on in conjunction with their needs here in the US, and recognize that American support for Duarte and for the repressive regime in the Philippines is not just a coincidence. It's part of the international global capitalist reach and corporate reach that the labor movement has to address on a global scale. And so that was the basis on which we built our work, and that is the basis on which I think that it's important for us in this discussion tonight also to consider international labor solidarity as a central part of what American social justice unionism is about. I'll stop there and we can have questions and discussion later on.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. Our next speaker is, if you give me a second here, a little disorganized. Our next speaker is Christine Yvette Lewis. She's a leader, organizer, secretary, and cultural outreach coordinator with Domestic Workers United, where she organizes domestic workers on the grassroots level, encouraging her peers to bring their voices to the continuous fight for justice. As a worker leader and multidisciplinary performance artist, Christine has pulled from her Calypsonian roots and her skills as a steel drum player, spoken word artist, and poet to get her message out and build power. She has been centrally involved in organizing partnerships with institutions like the Public Theater, Public Works on projects like Shakespeare in the Park for the past 8 years. Christine was featured on the Stephen Colbert Show to speak about domestic workers' Bill of Rights. So thank you, Christine, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooklyn for Peace, for having me in solidarity with the work that you all do here in Brooklyn as it matters to solidarity and social justice. Again, my name is Christine Lewis, and I am the Secretary, Cultural Outreach Coordinator with Domestic Workers United. Domestic Workers United is an immigrant women's group, women from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa, who are organizing for power, respect, fair labor standards, and the movement to end exploitation and oppression. In early spring of 2000, CAV, Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence Against Women Workers Project, and Andolan, organizing South Asian workers working in different services, sweatshops, nail salon, laundry, and domestic work, began discussion among domestic workers from all different communities to improve workers' condition for all domestic workers in the greater New York City region. And so other domestic organizations like Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees, Damayan, Filipino Migrant Workers Association, and Unity House Cleaners came on board. one could ask the question, why we organize? Yeah? We organize to end an era of exclusion from all social and labor legislation whose work is unprotected by union standards, such as National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, which excluded domestic workers and farm workers from organizing. Yet the National Labor Relations Act gives US workers the right to form unions and protect them from getting fired for joining a union. Ever since slavery was legally abolished, the government has refused to acknowledge two groups, which is domestic workers and farm workers. Also, the Fair Labor Standard Act, the FLSA, sets a federal minimum wage rate, maximum hours and overtime for employees of certain occupation. Yet casual employees such as babysitters and companions for the sick or elderly are excluded. Living domestic workers cannot get overtime. And the problems facing workers, and I'll kind of keep it really brief, because time is of the essence, is that women are working long hours, 12 to 14 hours a day. No guideline. Yeah. She even works when she has to see her doctor. But because, somebody else is next in line, she goes to work for fear of losing her job, believe it or not. She may even work through her lunch break. She's subjected to employers' verbal abuse, yes, threatening and calling her out of her name. Some have been beaten or sexually propositioned. And to compound all of this, as soon as the economic crisis of 2008 happened, she would have been the first to be fired. And as the foreclosure crisis hit right, left, and center, she would have been in the group of folks who was more than likely to lose her home or her apartment, depending on if she was living in a home with a foreclosure sign on its loan, right? Mind you, this woman who was trying to navigate her paycheck between taking care of her folks back on the islands, taking care of her family here, and still reaching into her pocket to pay for a frappuccino for her charge. And you all know the cost of a frappuccino, right? When her charge asks her, could I have a frappuccino? She really can't tell him no. She's also, in some cases, have to deal with discrimination and what she looks like and what she can bring to the table. Domestic workers work more hours for lower wages than any other worker. Many workers don't even earn enough to meet their basic needs. And I'll give you a brief context of why things are the way they are. One is global city. New York City is a global city that thrives on services, professional and financial service to run the economy, and low-wage services to serve that professional workforce. Therefore, domestic workers make it possible for their employers to go to work. Globalization, we have slavery, and women's work. This work, which is done inside the home, is seen as women's work. It has been called unskilled so that it could be exploited and taken advantage of. Women's work has always been made invisible, yet women's work is real work, which, by the way, make all other work possible. The law has excluded domestic workers from real protection as workers. Domestic workers are excluded from the definition of employee, even though there are over 200,000 of domestic workers in New York doing the work to support our families. Yes? We organize through base building, leadership development, ambassadorship, each one teach one, alliances. We have alliances with folks like Brooklyn for Peace, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, the clergy of churches, and culture. As I said before, we use culture as a way to express and to build capacity. Yes? Campaigns, some of our campaigns are the Justice Campaign. We won over $500,000 in back wages for exploited and abused workers. through the Urban Justice Center, which is Take Root Justice Center right now. Our grassroots campaign Victories. In 2003, we helped pass the city law to regulate agencies and make them inform workers of their rights and job duties and employers of their obligation. On August 31st, 2010, after 6 long years of going to Albany, the first ever historic Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was signed into law. It guaranteed overtime pay, 1 day off rest per week, and I think that has changed, 3 paid days off per year, and protection from discrimination and harassment, and inclusion on the Minimum Wage Act for companions. So for the domestic workers in New York City, a new day has dawned. The journey has just begun, right? And our win has set a precedent for other states to go after their very own Bill of Rights. And I think there's 11 or 12 states as we speak who has won their Bill of Rights. In 2007, DWU has been instrumental in the formation of the National Domestic Workers Alliance in Atlanta, Georgia, where it was deemed another world is possible. Yes. On the heels of that victory, we have to increase our organizing to make the Bill of Rights effective. Launch massive Know Your Rights campaign that will include education about the new laws and trainings for domestic workers to be able to assert their rights, considering that we can't unionize. It's one employer to one employee. We have also partnered with the Department of Labor on outreach and also to make sure cases get processed. In partnership with our alliances, our employers' alliances, we are also organizing dialogues with employers to educate them about the new law and get them to improve their employment practices. And I will cease here, but I want to say something before I end. The women of DWU ought to be commended for weaving 3 of our era's most important movement into one. The first one is a women's movement striking out at the stigma against household labor as women's labor and therefore not really labor at all. Number 2 is a workers' movement defying notions about what kind of workers can and should be organized. And number 3 is an immigrant movement melding the struggles for rights here and with the struggles for rights abroad. So it's really big, big work. And I can't emphasize enough these conversations that we're having with Brooklyn for Peace, how important community is to this struggle and this fight for equal rights and justice. Even though we're not in the parameters of unionizing, but going together, will the circle be unbroken in the by and by when we have each other holding up each other? Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Is you were working on you were working in this workshop. I forgot the name of it. Can you tell us a bit about the workshop you've been doing?
The Writers' Workshop?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the Pan America World Voices and the Worker Writers School has collaborated on bringing Worker Center to be able to tell their stories through poetic forms. And we've been writing for the past 10 years. And just this year, May Day, the 1st of May, we launched our first book, which is called, Coronavirus Haikus, a Worker Writers School. And so some of my work is in this haiku. It's speaking our truth to power. And in this League of Writers, the Taxi Workers Alliance, Retail Action Project, Damian, Filipino Migrant Workers Project, Street Vendors Project, the Picture the Homeless, and other groups who have been able to write their stories, speaking truth to power. So I'll put in the link where you could get the book. Yes. And those haikus are really, really, really riveting, and they come from a place of truth, especially in this time where, the COVID pandemic hit. and we couldn't sit around the table to break bread, so to speak, but we're able to meet on Zoom to write our truth, to write our truth, to speak our truth to power. And the work that we do at DWU, while the funding revolution will not be televised, and again, we're not unionized, we were able to raise money to give workers who are working in the shadows a little love offering stipend. And we do the CSA garden every Saturday on Nostrand to provide sustainable food for our workers and the community. And what we found out is that, folks come up to the table on Saturday and say, listen, lady, I'm not working, but could I have food? So it's just not for our community, not just for DWU, but for the community at large. And this food comes from the Phoenix Street Community Garden, and it's going to pivot in June to the Maple Street Garden. So we're doing the work with little, but doing the work steadfastly as it matters to our community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christine, and I hope Christine has very much reminded us how much we tend to forget our domestic workers and how they deserve the same rights as anybody else, and they deserve fair wages and good working conditions, just like all other workers do. So I hope you'll keep in touch with Domestic Workers United. And now for our next speaker, our final speaker is Steve Kramer. Steve is a Queens native who has recently retired from his position as the Executive Vice President at 1199 SEIU Healthcare Workers East, following a decades-long career. His work there started with the organizing of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in Washington Heights in the 1970s, and he has worked to move the labor movement forward and build capacity ever since. So I'll turn the microphone over to Steve.
Yeah, thank you and good evening, everyone. And to my previous speakers, how informative you are on everything, but most of all to Brooklyn for Peace and the role that you have played in continuing role that you play in terms of moving a progressive program forward. The fight that you've been having over, and I want to talk to labor directly and how we can best activate the labor movement and passing the bill that you have been fighting for in the city council that was referred to earlier in terms of moving the money, as well as the PRO Act. Clearly, it was just pointed out in terms of domestic workers not included in previous legislation and how hard it is for them to organize, as hard it is for everyone in the country to organize, but particularly domestic and farm workers. The PRO Act will move the situation forward. The bosses have been relentlessly attacking union organizing, as we just saw in Alabama, in terms of the attempt to organize the Amazon workers. If you knew the inside or read the details of the assault that was waged by the labor busters, the union busters, where they go into they investigate every single union advocate or suspected union advocate. They look into their personal backgrounds. They apply pressure from every direction in terms of them, both in the workplace and even outside the workplace. And so it is continues to be so difficult. And so we are urging everyone to do everything we can, as Matt said earlier, to make sure that the PRO Act is passed now that we have an opportunity. And to try and fight for anything in the past 4 years under the previous administration is a tribute to everyone on the phone, because just to survive and keep the head above water and to watch the news during that period was a real task. And to put forth a program like has been put forth, or a legislation, and I know that Tom Gogan, who was the representative from U.S. Labor Against the War at our 1199 offices, constantly communicated about moving the money from the military over to civilian purposes. And we now have an opportunity. Like we can't, it's hard for us to believe. I think we kind of wake up in the morning and say, holy smoke, talking about actually really ending the war in Afghanistan instead of making it propaganda that's going to end and so forth, for President Biden to come out and indicate that this is going to be a date certain, not based on new information on the ground, which always becomes an excuse for the extension, but to see the longest war in U.S. history finally come to an end, or projected to come to an end. I don't know if any of us will totally believe it until it actually happens. But on the other hand, it gives us tremendous momentum to make a sweeping reform in terms of the transferring and reducing military spending, which we know is hundreds of billions of dollars, way beyond what is necessary to protect the United States of America. So whatever can be done by every one of you on the phone, family and friends, to encourage them to call your city council representative. We urge you to do that because that pressure has been working. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, as this campaign started, it was hard to get 2 or 3 or 4 sponsors. That grew from 4 to 5 to 10 to 15, and now there are 23 sponsors, just 3 short of a majority. So from every point of view, we have a real opportunity to pass something which would really be historic for New York City to come out against drastically cutting military spending and using it for all the purposes which are now being proposed in Washington. And they're asking, the big attack is where you're going to get the money from. Well, this surely is a big source where the money can come from. And with the momentum created by the call for the end of the war in Afghanistan, we really have an opportunity. So if everybody on this phone can have that outreach. The other part of the outreach, and that goes obviously, very obviously for the PRO Act, in terms of increasing labor and the power of labor. I think we all know that labor unions have additional power and additional say in terms of the way elected officials think. They know that they mobilize and get out the vote in big numbers, and they have the organization and often the money to do that. The politicians rely on the unions for that, and as well as we rely on them to pass various legislation. I found through the years, whether it be the Vietnam War, Matt talked about organizing in the 60s and 70s, or the Iraq War, or the Afghanistan War, in virtually every case, or even in Nicaragua, the war in the Contras, and in El Salvador, that's not the primary task union officials speak to, but they know that membership joins unions to make sure that their wages and benefits and conditions of work are addressed. But they also try and expand that in every way, and oftentimes it takes the rank and file to push them in terms of issues of this kind. So if you have members of your family or friends or neighbors who are involved in a labor or work in a union, or also have contacts in a union, we have a tremendous opportunity here to have New York come out and basically say that the billions and billions need to be cut from the military budget and utilized for all the purposes that are needed, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be family and childcare, and all of the other things that we know are such a necessity. So more than anything on this call, we urge everyone to do that. And your personal calls to your city council representative are obviously very, very critical. But if you make it double fold when you speak to your spouse or partner, or your children, or those others, friends and relatives and neighbors, as well, to also make the calls. I think the information will be provided to you, the call-in information. So please do that, and for the PRO Act to contact Senator Schumer, Gillibrand, and your congressperson as well. The labor movement has increasingly found it difficult to organize, even with the gig economy that exists. But yet, if this passes, we will see a revitalization of the labor movement. And as we know, just coming, as I referred to, from the past when it was almost impossible to be optimistic other than the hope that we would be able to kick Trump out of Washington, as we were able to do spectacularly. We took 82 million votes and a hell of a lot of hard work, and I'm sure virtually all of you were involved in that hard work. Little did we know that the dog that he is would get, no, that's true. That's a shame because I'm a dog lover. So the scoundrel that he is, and anti-American and anti-democratic, that he would get 74 million votes. And if there's the threat to the United States, I think, as we all know, is not from foreign forces, where the U.S. military has shown 3 times over that nation building is a total failure, whether it be in Vietnam, whether it be in Afghanistan, whether it be in Iraq, or wherever it is, that these nation building campaigns have to completely stop, or what we did to Libya in destroying the Libyan government and basically having a governmentless state, or stateless even there. All of those things need to stop, and no, we do not need to be intervening in everybody else's politics throughout the world. We need to, the threat in the United States really is the domestic terrorists that attempted to take over the government, if you wish, on January 6th. And the true colors came out. That movement is a super dangerous movement, but the U.S. military does not need to be enriched to fight that movement. That's an internal fight that needs to be waged by the government here. So the military budget surely can be cut, and we urge you and ask you once again, repetition helps. It helps all of us to make sure to make the calls on that and on the PRO Act to your federal representatives, so that we can really move our country forward. Thinking about the fact that New York would be outstanding. If any city comes out, and particularly the bigger cities in our nation, if they come out for Move the Money, it really makes a very, very big statement and sets a whole climate that changes what goes on throughout our nation and startles the elected officials, or brings the best out of them. But in this particular case, for New York to do such a thing, I don't remember in my lifetime or any of our lifetimes that anything of that kind happening. But if New York City would pass that resolution, we only need 3 more council reps to get it introduced in the city council, and with a majority to go on to have it passed. So within our unions and to the city council reps, hopefully we can all get up and make this happen, make the calls, so that we can all look forward to really pushing the administration open to making sure that we succeed in this. So lastly, I'd just like to say, I finished my 50th year in 1199. It was a great career to be working there. Nothing I could find any finer, working for a union that really pushes hard for making sure that we make progress. But even in that union, it took the rank and file. And so if you know rank and file is, or your family knows rank and file is, who are part of unions, who are delegates or shop stewards, for them to walk in, for them to make a pitch to the union leadership and the union presidents, that will go far to, they won't need that pitch in terms of the PRO Act, but they certainly will need that pitch in terms of Move the Money. So I thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum, and let us move on to more victories in the future and make this a victory as well. The victory I'm talking about, of course, is Afghanistan finally being stated in no uncertain terms. It is coming to an end after being the longest war in U.S. history. So thank you, and best of luck to all of us.
Hey, Thank you very much, Steve. And let's take a moment to give, I don't know if we can hear it, a round of applause to all our speakers. Now, before we take questions from the audience, Matt said he's got the other ask, which he's going to talk about in a minute. But that will also answer one of the questions somebody sent in was, what is the city council bill that he's asking us to support? And that, in fact, is what Matt is going to talk about. So Matt will answer that particular question and tell you what we'd like you to do. So go ahead, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. And I just want to say those were spectacular speeches. Steve, 50 years as the leader of 1199 with the rank and file behind you, we can understand why 1199 has been one of the unions in the forefront of bringing the question not only of workers' rights and workers' benefits and workers' standard of living and elevating them, but also connecting it with those issues outside of the immediate job questions. And your union has been in the forefront of that as far back as I can remember. In fact, when I tried to do a Google search for the promotional material for this forum tonight, and I put in unions for peace, the pictures that came up inevitably were 1199 workers carrying banners that said healthcare, not warfare, and others like that. And there are other unions also, of course, but 1199 has been one of the main, and we thank you for that, and we thank you, Steve. And I thank also the other two speakers and my friend Christine for connecting the issue to the community and to women workers and low paid wage workers. So what is this all about? Many of you know about it already, but Brooklyn for Peace has been one of the main forces in a coalition of some 60 organizations. It's called Move the Money NYC. And we're on Facebook and we're on Twitter. So if you want to find out about it, but basically, it's been a year and some months now, February, and of course with a year of the pandemic in between, which really hampered our activities. But in February 2019, this man here, Council Member Adonis Rodriguez of Upper Manhattan, introduced Resolution 747, which today is called 747A because it was amended. He introduced that into the city council. And that's a bill that would let New York City tell Congress to move the money from war to our communities. Specifically, if it was passed, it would put our city on official record opposing excessive military spending in Congress. The city would then be able to urge Congress to cut substantially the annual Pentagon budget that now accounts for varying estimates, but well over half of the annual federal discretionary budget, leaving pennies literally for the things that matter to New Yorkers and to cities and states across the country. I'm talking about, how was your subway ride lately or before the pandemic? How are our schools doing? How is the sanitation of our streets and parks doing? How is affordable housing programs doing? All of these get sacrificed to that giant Pentagon budget and to these endless wars that Steve alluded to. Again, if it was passed, it would, the second part of that resolution 747A is that it would allow the city to mandate in-depth public hearings where you and I and other advocates could stand up. We'd have lots of press coverage and find out how much money of our taxes are going to pay for these wars, are going to feed the Pentagon, are going to, enrich the profits of the arms manufacturers, Boeing and General Dynamics and the rest of them. How much do we pay in taxes to the federal government that we don't get back for these vital public services for our residents? Who has moved the money in New York City? We are about 60 organizations. Labor, 1199 is certainly one of them. PSC CUNY, the Professional Staff Congress of CUNY, is another one. UUP, United University Professions, which covers teachers and nursing staff. As an aside, Brooklyn for Peace joined forces with UUP at Downstate Hospital when Governor Cuomo threatened to cut jobs there. And we were out on the picket lines. We went to Albany because as a peace organization, we always want to connect the issue of peace, not only in a moral sense, but in the immediate sense of what it does to the standards of living of people in our communities in terms of their health. Cuomo closed I believe, 12 hospitals in New York City. Then we had a pandemic, and nobody said, "Gee, where are all the beds? Where did they go?" Well, he had under Steve Berger, one of his acolytes, a group that went around searching on how they could close hospitals, and indeed they did. And then we paid for them during the pandemic. If you can add your group to our coalition, if it's not already a member, by just emailing us at this email that's on your screen right now. Notice the little dot in there. Don't put a dash. Move the money .nyc@gmail.com. Say my group, my Black Association wants to join Move the Money because we think that that we suffer. My block suffers from the imbalance in federal spending priorities. What did we do? We started with one council member. We ended up with 23, including the public advocate recently. Jemani Williams has sponsored this. He is one of the few citywide officials that are allowed to sponsor and vote on a resolution in the city council. These are the postcards that we sent. On one side was Dr. King with his famous quotation about war spending. And on the other side, of course, was 3,000 residents signed that to their council members, and it had an effect. We set up tables at street fairs. Here's my brother, Ed Goldman, at one of our street fairs collecting signatures. I see my friend Sammy there on the right in the green shirt. We had dozens of those until the pandemic hit. And we lobbied and we wrote letters and emails and called and visited our council members. So again, February 19, we had one sponsor. Today, a year or so later, even with the pandemic, 23 members of the New York City Council are now on board. We want more. Steve misspoke a little bit. We could have a majority. In fact, there are two other resolutions and an intro pending that have more sponsors than us. They would divest New York City from nuclear weapons production investments and make New York City a nuclear-free city and advocate an end to the development of nuclear weapons. But they are stalled, and I'll tell you why. They have 31 sponsors. We have 23 sponsors. It's the speaker, folks. Speaker is Corey Johnson, and that's a very powerful position. So despite the fact that you may have a majority or even a supermajority of the 50 or so council members, doesn't mean that your resolution is going to get to the floor for a vote. First, you have to get a committee. Ours is in the federal and state legislative committee, and that has to report it out. But then the speaker gets the ultimate say of what's going to happen to your resolution. And frankly, Corey has been an obstacle. He brands himself as a progressive, and he is a progressive on many issues, but he says, nah, nobody's interested in Washington about what the city has to say. We beg to differ. New York has a very important voice. Did you know that in Brooklyn, for example, each one of our Democratic congressional reps, with the exception of Hakeem Jeffries, who we are pushing hard to reverse his position, has voted against the Pentagon budget year in and year out. My Congress member, Yvette Clark, votes against it. Brooklyn for Peace pushes her. And let's remember that when you call your reps on the PRO Act, you may have a Democratic rep and Democratic senators. They want to hear from you. And we want them to hear from you, because if they don't hear from you, they don't think that people are excited about anything.
30 more seconds, Matt.
Okay, I'm finished. I'm going to just say, write it down, folks. This is what I want you to write down. bit.ly myCM with a little hyphen in there. That will give you the contact info. First of all, it will tell you who your council member is, and it will tell you how to contact them. Then you call or you email or you write them and urge them to co-sponsor resolution 747A. It could say /2019 because that's the year, but it'll get through with this. And tell them you want to move the money from war to our communities. And you can, and because the council speaker is so important, please call him at this number right here, 212-788-7210. Write him at speakerjohnson@council.nyc.gov and tell him, Corey, get out of the doorway and let this resolution go. Let us put New York City on the record to move the money from war to our communities, especially during this pandemic, which has shown us how badly served our communities are, particularly communities of color and poor communities. We can do it. It's going to take your help to do it. Please join us.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I hope people will listen. It's now time for questions. We have received several questions. Let me take a few that are on. The first question is addressed to Christine Lewis. I guess some people want to know more about who's included in the domestic workers. So someone asked, do you include home health care workers in the group of domestic workers? And I guess I'd extend that by saying if you'd let us know which workers you particularly are working with.
Right. So nannies, elder caregivers, and housekeepers. I know that the elder caregivers are working with the union, I think local 1199. However, there is a conversation that's brewing with national mobilization against sweatshops, which is agitating Governor Cuomo's office around workers who work, elder caregivers, who work 24 hours and get paid for 12. So we have these ongoing conversations. I don't know what the local 1199 is doing or saying, but these workers are working tirelessly. They're working stressed, they're working sick, and they're working with patients who have all forms of ailments, and they're working 24 hours and getting paid for 12 or 13. So yes, our bill encompasses the elder caregivers, the housekeepers, and the nannies. Now, because let me just finish.
Sorry.
Now, because we can't unionize, our recourse is a legal response, in that if workers could prove that they've been stiffed their wages, we have the pro bono lawyers. Yes? If that answers the question.
Okay, thank you.
I would also like to speak to what Christine was saying about the home health aid workers. My mom is a home health aid worker, and she's like from the same zip code. We live in the same zip code that Christine is in, and she raised me on a home health aid salary. And growing up, she did work 24 hours, which means for like 3 or 4 days a week, I didn't have a mother.
Okay.
And that didn't mean that we weren't living paycheck to paycheck, though. What she had to sacrifice and what she got in return didn't add up. And I think the work that Christine is doing is really important.
Okay, the next question is, are unions in the Move the Money Coalition? What can we do to move that? Can we see BFP and Peace Action and other peace organizations meeting with the New York City CLC and add our organizational muscle to passing the PRO Act? I'm not sure who I'm not sure who wants to take that. Any of our speakers want to try that? If not,
Well,
Matt?
I'll do something about it.
Okay, great.
Just from UUP has also participated in this Move the Money campaign. What you do, and I think Steve talked about it before, if you're a shop steward or just a rank and file member of your union, take the question, take the issue to your leadership, take it to an exec board meeting, take it to a delegate meeting, take it to a membership meeting, and have material which is available from the Move the Money campaign to explain why this is important, what other groups are involved, what other unions are involved. Because if you want to get your union engaged, chances are you'll be in better position if you can say that there are other unions already involved, like PSC, like 1199, like UUP. And so I would say that that's the main thing that people should do in their own organizations, is just take it up with your fellow workers, take it up with your leadership, and push it and push it and push it some more with the material and with the background that the campaign has available on its website.
Okay, thank you. This next question comes from Nancy Price. She asks Christine if she could provide her email. Nancy is with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, US, and one of the issue committees would like Christine to speak to them. So, and I suspect that's a question others might like as well. So if if Christine can provide her email, probably the chat would be a good place to put it.
I did. I just did.
Okay,
Thanks for
great.
that. Yes.
Okay, terrific. Okay, the next question is, and this I probably to Mike again. What will be the war issues that labor should be encouraged to take a stand on? Assuming troops are out of Afghanistan, Yemen, military budget, military bases. They don't say it, but all or others. Mike, which would you prioritize?
Well, I think that right now the main question is the military budget, and the focus can be on this Move the Money campaign, not just here in New York City, but all over the country. It's a question of the federal budget, and I think Steve mentioned correctly that well over half of the discretionary budget of the U.S. government is devoted to the military. And that's just not sustainable for a society that takes care of its own people. So I think that that's a very important focus. The problem in the labor movement these days is that it's hard to have people's attention on international affairs and on labor foreign policy when there's so much on the agenda in the domestic arena, and where war is not immediately on everybody's mind the way it was in 2003 and 2004. So the task is really within the labor movement and in society as a whole, where the peace movement is also rather sort of small compared to what it has been in the not too recent past, to draw the connections. You know, the war isn't over. The military is still there. The militarization of the police, militarization of the border, these militarization of, the military equipment going to police forces so that they are occupying armies in our communities, particularly in communities of color. Those are all questions that I think are immediate and urgent for the labor movement to take up. And I think that is where I would go with it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, someone asked, what does rank and file mean in the union organizing context? And I'd extend that a little bit. Union organizing has changed a lot in recent years, in large part because the law has become less favorable. Employers have become more aggressive, and there are more uncovered workers, not only the ones that Christine talked about, but a lot of the gig workers as well. So how are unions organizing rank and file members, and how does that differ from the traditional organizing model? Anybody like to take that question?
Maybe Steve.
Maybe Steve, yeah, I was going to say, that sounds like a question that Steve would have some experience with. Steve, you want to take that? I don't think we may have we got him?
I could.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well. Go ahead.
Rank and file members are the everyday members of the union. The delegates or shop stewards are elected to that role, but they are also rank and file members. And the rank and file members are the key really to new organizing in that particular workshop, but also supporting the new organizing that's needed elsewhere. And the rank and file obviously only participates to the extent that they feel like there's being progress made in terms of their wages, benefits, conditions of work, and it obviously inspires them more to participate in the actions of the union, and also to solicit other non-union workers in their workplace to become unionized, or also outside of the workplace in other industries and elsewhere to basically advertise, if you wish, that, hey, with a union, it's made such a difference the way the rights are and the way the conditions are at work. So depending upon it varies obviously from union to union, the level of participation, the activism, but to the extent that they are controlling their particular workplace and that they are the ones who the boss has to listened to and that the boss really takes heed of. To that extent, they will be active members. And that really is the key to continuing that level of organizing. And in these times, we have an opportunity now with the PRO Act on the table, with the NLRB now being turned around to really get much greater activism on the political front and on every front by the rank and file members of the unions.
Hey, thank you. Next question comes from Ann Ambia. Ann asks, she says, our youth of color are being pushed into the military by high schools on career day, etc., as their #1 career choice. In fact, the military is the only federal jobs program we have. What do you think the role of labor should be to get into schools to offer and encourage our students into union jobs instead? That's not directed to anybody, so whoever wants to take it.
Well, let me start, and others can come on. This is Michael. I think that the Biden administration is putting forward a very broad program for environmental and infrastructure changes that are going to, they say, create thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of jobs. And the jobs question is a very, very real matter. And so I think that to the extent that those jobs come in, because that program passes and there are opportunities for young people, what we can do as unions, as labor, is to go into schools and to go into, to generate apprenticeship programs, to draw workers into those new jobs, and to coordinate with the community colleges, especially, where a lot of working class kids go, because that's the next step towards getting the skills that you need, and to coordinate the expansion of free enrollment or cheaper, lower cost enrollment into community colleges, to coordinate those curricula with the new jobs that are coming, and to coordinate all that with where the jobs are leaving when the fossil fuel industry contracts and when the military industry contracts. Those are all complicated questions that have to be negotiated, but I think that those are the main ways in which we proceed.
Any of our other speakers want to add anything? Okay, the next question comes from one of Brooklyn for Peace's other vice chairs, Veronica Nunn, and Veronica wants to ask, what about unions that are very powerful and can be looked at as detrimental to communities? And the example she gives is police unions. Can anyone ask what position people should take on that?
I would speak on that. The police union is not a union. It's a internal society for the advocacy for, in virtually every case, for the protection of the police to do whatever they want to do. New York is one of the worst examples. The fact that they call themselves unions is a scandal. In fact, even though they do negotiate contracts on the behalf of the associations that they're part of, but they traditionally have taken a horrendous role. There are exceptions to the rule, but they are far and few between the exceptions that come out openly and say that when a police officer commits a crime of any kind, then they should serve the same penalty as any other citizen who commits that crime, as we obviously recently saw in the George Floyd trial. But that's, again, one of the few and far between, and the police associations up till now have played a very, very backward role. So the fact that they call themselves union is really a misnomer to the moment. Could they be representative, and could that change? It could. Eric Adams obviously was part of those. People of color or African-American police officers who took them on about the discrimination within the police force. But in the end, that union remains in the hands of very, very backward and racist elements. As we all saw even in New York with the Pantaleo, who still has not served one day in jail or even gone to trial for the murder of Eric Garner in Staten Island. And of course, the union there played a terrible role as well. So that's my comment on the misnomer of a police union really being a benevolent association.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I guess we got time for one or two more questions, probably.
Good question.
The next question asks about the recent action to try to organize in Alabama for Amazon. How do you feel that affects labor, and what does that portend for the future? If anybody wants to take that.
Yeah, I really would like to just say a couple words about that. If you ask people in this country, do you want to be in a union? Or do you support unions? Would you want to be in a union? About 60% or so say yes. But there's less than 12% of the people in this country who are in unions. So that means 80% of people who want to be in a union aren't. And it's not because unions aren't trying to organize them. It's because of the kind of anti-union activity that companies like Amazon have executed at a place like Bessemer, Alabama, where in particular, there were mandatory meetings where workers had to come in and listen to the propaganda of the boss about how terrible the union is and how wonderful the company is. The PRO Act, we've talked about it before, that would make it illegal for companies to have those kinds of mandatory meetings with their workers. It's very, very important to get that PRO Act passed. Otherwise, I think we're going to see this over and over and over again, and it's going to get worse and worse, as it has been for the last 40 years. And I think that PRO Act is so very important, and I just want to call people's attention to it again. Call your representatives, call your senators, call your people, and make sure that the PRO Act is high on their agenda. It did pass in the House, now it's in the Senate.
Yeah, I would add something, and that is, our topic is essentially how unions should be allied with peace and justice and social justice groups. And I think one of the changes we've seen due to the problems in organizing union is to see those alliances become ever more important. Good example is it's really hard to organize fast food workers because everything's franchised and so many of them are part-time. As a result, a lot of unions moved to the Fight for 15, where they got together with racial justice and other social justice organizations to increase wages in a different fashion. And so I think that's a good supplement to things like the PRO Act. That's a good reason why we all do have to work together, whether it's in our unions, in our community organizations, and elsewhere. And I think Christine raised that point also, because much as she'd like to unionize a lot of the workers that she's fighting for, if you're a worker who has an individual as your only employer, it's just not possible. And in addition, so many of the labor laws exempt our domestic workers. So we have to find other ways of working together to pass legislation. And I think that's a really important point that we can't stress too much. And is a real purpose of our organizing this forum, to find ways we can work together.
And could I say we did it? We did it in Albany in 2010, right? An informal work group that went to Albany, that agitated Albany for 7 years, from 2003 to 2010. We got the Bill of Rights passed. And that was what? It wasn't unionizing, but going with union members, going with clergies of churches, and going with the community. So yes, there's other ways. Yes.
Okay, do we have time for, Natasha, do we have time for another question?
Eric Staub has a question.
One more question, yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't you let Eric ask his question? Can you?
Eric, you're muted.
Oh, so it's not so much a question, but Steve Kramer will recognize that when the hospital workers started to organize, it wasn't legal to organize hospital workers. We never went into a hospital to organize it when they didn't have mandatory meetings of the workers that were required if you were working there, and where the bosses would talk about keeping the union out. And because of pressure from the ground, from the workers in the shops, Governor Rockefeller, of all people, changed the law in New York State to include healthcare workers, and the hundreds of thousands of workers were organized. So I think Christine has something to look forward to. The fact that domestic workers are not included now doesn't mean that they won't be included forever. Thank you.
Okay, I think our time is nearly up. I'm supposed to summarize things for the finish, but in doing so, I would like to thank our audience for coming and being so attentive when you couldn't actually talk except through the chat. Like to thank our speakers who really gave us some wonderful perspectives, and I think in some cases gave us a lot to think about that we hadn't thought about before. Brooklyn for Peace is committed to these forums. We're trying to have one every month or so. And I hope people will keep an eye out for our future forums. And also, please donate if you can. We know these are tough times. A lot of people can't afford to donate. But if you can, go to our website. Whatever you can afford, we'd very much appreciate. We can't have our fundraiser this year because of COVID. So again, thanks for coming. And if you want to chat with each other, please feel free to do so. So again, thanks again. And I don't know if anybody else has a last word.
You are all so beautiful and wonderful. It's been my distinct honor to work with Brooklyn for Peace and the people who work with us. And I like to take a picture because you guys look so great. So if you can, if you want to, I'm all for consent. Just turn your cameras